Hello, and welcome to the North American Trainer Association T6 Type Formation Ground School. This presentation has been put together by Greg Dexter and myself, Jim Cook. During this presentation, we're going to review the guideline standards and requirements for getting your wing and then lead card. We'll quickly review what a normal four-ship flight looks like from start to end. We'll then review a lot of the flying, single ship and section takeoffs, airwork, recovery, power settings. We'll finish up with reviewing radio communications, aircraft and hand signals, a few emergency procedures, and then notes on the clinic, how to get the most out of your clinic experience. Governance for formation flying has been established by a set of type-specific user groups that do formation flying. They've come together to form a formation and safety team, and each one of these organizations sends representatives to the formation and safety team meetings to develop standards and guidelines and training materials for formation flying. They have a website, www.flyfast.org. And on this website, you can download documents in PDF format. You're going to need to use your training records, your VAL form, and you can also download the training manuals. Now, NATA has adopted the Formation Pilot's Knowledge Guide, which is a PDF document available on the FlyFast website. And ultimately, there'll be an Appendix D that goes over T6 specific procedures, and we'll be reviewing all those procedures during this presentation. There are hour requirements for your wing and your lead card. Those are published in the on the FlyFast website. You need to attend a ground school, and you'll ultimately, during the clinic, will have to go through a recommendation ride and then a check ride with the pilot examiner to get your card. All the NATA check rides will be done in the four-ship. So as a wingman, you must demonstrate proficiency in slots 2 and 4, and as a lead, proficiency in slots 1 and 3. And you'll need your formation card if you want to fly in formation at air shows. This will be one of the documents that the FAA representative wants you to present before they give you permission to fly in the air show. Now we're going to review the routine procedures in a four-ship formation flight. The flight starts with a brief, it ends with a debrief. It's anywhere from a little bit less than an hour to a little bit longer than an hour and a half. About 2/3 of the time we spend flying, about a third of the time we spend getting ready to fly. Since everybody wants to be flying, any steps that needlessly increase the ground time tend to get noticed. When we're in the briefing, NATA promotes the use of a briefing card that gives a standardized format for going through all the steps of the briefing for the lead's perspective. It also provides a place to write down frequencies, times, and any other notes you take during the briefing. Typically, the lead does all the talking during the briefing. Make sure you save your questions for the end, but ask questions if you have them, and obviously don't leave if you still have questions in your head at the end of the briefing. From the lead's perspective, remember the briefing should be brief. It's not a mini ground school. Theoretically, a lot of the things that we want to do are standard and can be briefed as such. Leave time after the briefing before the start time for an element brief and an IP student brief. Ask for questions at the end, but don't break if people look confused. Once you get to your plane, be ready to start your engine on a brief time. That means you're pre-flighted, you're strapped in, your chocks are, you've made sure that your chocks are away, and your engine's primed and you're ready to go. We'll either start on a brief time hack. Typically this happens at some of the larger clinics where there's planes spread all over the ramp, and not everybody's in eyesight of each other. However, every now and then we are all parked next to each other, and it's possible to start with a visual hand signal. And so the hand signals are two-part. If you're ready to crank your engines, you sit there with your hand on top of your canopy bow. If everybody's parked the line abreast, this is a signal you pass up the line to lead. And then once lead sees that everybody is ready to crank, he'll raise his hand over his head with his index fingers extended and make a circular motion with his index finger indicating it's time to start your engines. Once you have your engine started and your avionics turned on, just monitor the briefed check-in frequency. Typically, the lead will check in the flight, something like red flight, check in, red lead. Then you'll listen for red 2. And if one of the members of the flight doesn't check in and you're red 4, just wait 2 or 3 seconds. And if you don't hear anything from red 3, then just say red 4, and that lets the leader know that everybody's checked in but number 3. Everybody's is on the frequency except number 3. After the lead has gotten the flight ready to taxi out, he'll take you out to the run-up area. And you need to be thinking before you start taxiing what the other guys' planes look like, where they're going to come towards you from their parking spots, and which guy you need to get in front of and which guy you need to get behind. Your taxi speed will be set by the lead. It's usually less than 10 knots. Keep 1 or 2 plane lengths between you and the plane in front of you. And as we taxi down the taxiway, we want to stay out of phase with the aircraft in front of us. Remember, we weave side to side so that we can see directly in front of us. And we try to keep this very synchronous, crossing the center line at the same time, at the same angle. And this is actually where the air show begins. Once you get to the run-up area, space about 10 feet between wingtips, park at the same angle as the guy in front of you. Try to line up the heads. Obviously avoid taxi lights. Complete your run-up and your configuration checks and be on the brief takeoff frequency and pass the ready signal up the line. And the way you pass the ready signal, it's hand on top of the canopy bow, thumbs up, and that means I'm ready to go and everybody down the line from me is ready to go. So if you're number 2 in this flight, you wouldn't put your hand up on top of the canopy bow until you verified that number 3 and 4 have their hand up on top of their canopy bow. Suppose during the run-up, one of the guys in the flight, in this case number 3, bails. What would you do? Well, first thing is probably a good idea to switch back to your tactical frequency so you're not discussing your options on ground tower or Unicom. You want to renumber the flight. 4 now becomes 3. Tell number 3 to taxi back either before or after you take the runway. Consider what you're going to do now that you don't have an alternate lead in this case, and make sure everyone understands the plan before you take the runway. When we line up on the runway, lead will always take the downwind side. The reason being that, as you'll find out during a section takeoff, a 2-ship takeoff lead always gets airborne and is about 10 feet in the air before number 2 gets airborne on section takeoffs. And we don't want the wind to be blowing the airborne aircraft into the one that's still on the runway. So the lead will always take the downwind side and will always get airborne first. Make sure you have your wingtips over the grass. Even on a 200-foot wide runway, it's good to practice this and practice going down the runway with your wingtip over the grass. Angling to see down the runway, match lead's angle. Be up pretty far forward next to lead. And if you sight down the leading and trailing edge of lead's wing and put your eyeballs in between those 2 lines, you'll probably be in very good position. Remember, if you're number 4, you have to call red 4 is on. Next, we take off, we go flying, we come back and we land. And we're going to discuss all of this extensively during the rest of the slideshow. But to just finish the prototypical flight, after we land, lead will collect everybody on the taxiway right after we exit. Do your post-landing checks with your flaps up. And if you see a guy in front of you or beside you giving you this duckbill signal with his hand, it means your flaps are still down. The taxi procedure back is pretty much the same as taxiing out. When you get to your parking spot, consider who your prop blast might be blasting. And a lot of guys manage to be pulling into their parking spot just as their prop is going to high angle of attack and starting to pull back on the throttle. Shutdown is brief, so if we're spread all over the ramp, typically lead will say just shut down when you get into your parking spot because we don't want a lot of spinning props out there. However, if you happen to line up close to each other on the ramp when you come back to park, there is a shutdown signal. So if you're ready to shut down your engine, you put your right hand on top of the canopy bow and you put your left hand on the mixture knob. Once lead sees that everybody's ready to shut down, he'll raise his hand as a fist, and then as he lowers it abruptly, that means to pull back on the mixture to idle cutoff. After you've chocked your aircraft, we meet at lead's aircraft or wherever we've been told to meet for the debriefing. And you want to be there on time, punctual. There's no refueling, there's no covering, there's no BSing with guys on the ramp. Just show up at the debrief. We always discuss safety issues first, and then the debrief starts with whoever's in the back seat of number 4 all the way up through the front seat of lead. And the goal and objective of the debrief is to observe, learn, listen to critiques, and take home some pointers for the next flight. We're now going to talk about single ship and section takeoffs. In the T6 community, we either make 2 ship takeoffs called a section takeoff or single ship takeoffs. And how do we decide which one we're going to do? Well, first of all, the T6 wingspan is 42 feet, so the minimum runway width for a section takeoff is 100 feet. So when we would do single ship takeoffs, when the runway is less than 100 feet, perhaps when there's crosswinds that seem too strong to make section takeoffs advisable, every now and then the FAA at an air show will not let us do section takeoffs even though the runway is wide enough. And we like to do single ship takeoffs from time to time during training because it's fun to do. Just for review, the lead will always take the downwind side of the runway during the lineup before takeoff. So let's review the signals for a formation section takeoff. Remember, lead is waiting for number 4 to say that he's on the runway. Red 4 is on. Then lead's going to stare at 2, indicating I'm ready to run up and take off for you. If you give number 2, if you give a nod, then lead's going to give the run-up signal, which is a circular motion with his index finger. Then lead and 2 go heads down in the cockpit, go to 2,000 RPM. They check for appropriate manifold pressure, oil pressure, fuel pressure, temperatures. Last check on configuration. If lead's good, he's going to look outside the cockpit and stare at 2. 2, if you're good, you give a nod, at which point lead's going to give a big, slow head nod, and when his chin reaches the bottom of that nod, lead is going to release brakes, let his aircraft straighten out, let it start to accelerate down the runway. He's going to set 30 inches. We're going to accelerate to 80 knots, tail high, and once we hit around 80 knots, we're going to rotate and climb out and then accelerate through 100 knots. And this is what it looks like. Once the lead element is rolling, the second element will start its run up using the same steps, but the second element waits for the lead element to get airborne before it does release its brakes. So here's a video of a 2-ship section takeoff. You watch number 2 line up with the leading and trailing edges of lead's wings. Keep in mind that lead is canted in towards the runway, so when at brake release you'll see lead's right wing sweep forward. It looks a little bit like 2 got sucked at that point, but actually it's just the fact that the airplane's turning on the runway to straighten out, head down the runway. Also notice during the rotation that lead gets airborne before number 2, and also that the leader doesn't look down to raise his gear. There's the lineup. Signal to go to 2,000. Checking oil pressure, manifold pressure, fuel pressure, final check on configurations. Now checking on 2. Here comes the head nod. Brake release, straighten out. Lead's going to 30 inches now if he wasn't already. Tail's coming up, accelerating to 80 knots. There's the rotation. Lead's in the air about 10 feet in front of 2, and then there comes the gear. What about single ship takeoffs? What are the signals for that? Again, your lead is going to wait for red 4 to say red 4 is on. He'll stare at 2, indicating are you ready to go? If you give a nod, that means you are. Next lead will signal the run up. We'll go to lead will go to 2,000 RPM and make his checks: manifold pressure, oil pressure, fuel pressure, temperatures. And at this point, lead is going to just release brakes and go. Straighten out, except this time the power setting will be full power, 36 inches, 2250. Again, we'll wait to 80 knots before we rotate. And as number 2 and 3 and 4, you each wait till the aircraft in front of you takes off and you see air under their tires. So in review, for a typical section takeoff, lead will accelerate and be at 30 inches, 2250 is the wingman, prop full forward, whatever manifold pressure is required to maintain your relative spacing. We're going to accelerate to 80 knots, which means we'll need to be tail high as we go down the runway, and we'll rotate at 80 knots. Number 2 gets airborne after lead is about 10 feet in the air. During the roll, never let your inboard wingtip cross the center line. By the same token, trying to keep your outboard wingtip over the grass for the entire roll. Once lead is through 100 knots, you'll start power reductions to get to about 25 inches and 2,000 RPM in the climb out. And as a wingman, you want to set 2,000 RPM once you're below 30 inches, and then use manifold pressure to maintain positioning. Common errors that we see during the takeoff roll is wing falls back or gets sucked, and we want to avoid that because if there's any directional control problems during the takeoff roll on the lead's part, if you're in the appropriate position as the wingman, if lead is having a problem, you'll be able to get out in front of him and take off before he crosses the runway center line. Sometimes the wingman gets too far forward. This is not during the takeoff roll, but after we take off, we refer to that as crossing the 3-9 line, or the imaginary line between the wingtips. And if you should go flying out in front of lead, you might very well be given the lead, and your leader will be directing you what to do. Sometimes the wingman gets airborne before the lead. Again, this is a safety of flight issue because the winds are blowing from you towards the lead most of the time, and we want to avoid that. Sometimes we forget to raise our gear. Sometimes the 4th guy in the flight forgets to call that number 4 is airborne. And sometimes on new leads, they forget to manage power reduction so that the rest of the flight can rejoin on them. So in this picture here, number 502 is the wingman. However, he got airborne before lead. You can see lead is just about to take off, or just starting to get air under his tires. And again, what's dangerous about this is if there were a wind, it's going to be blowing from number 502 to number 77. So you potentially could get blown into the guy, and also as you gain altitude, you might very well lose sight below a wing. Don't do that. You should be stepped down. Remember, during the Section 8 takeoff, the second element will roll when they see air under the tires of the lead element. Remember, you have to call off. So number 4, you're getting to talk a lot. You say red 4 is on the runway, and once you're airborne, you say red 4 is off the runway, or red 4 is off. And once lead hears that, he knows that both elements are airborne, and at some point he'll start a rejoin turn. And during these turns, we always place number 2 on the inside of the turn. For a single ship takeoff, and again, we do single ship takeoffs because it's fun to do. Sometimes the crosswinds are too great, and sometimes the runway is not 100 feet wide. Remember, everybody rolls when they see air under the tire of the aircraft in front of them. It's a max power takeoff. And remember, if you're number 4, you have to say red 4 is off. That indicates to lead that the last ship in the flight got airborne. You'll start a rejoin turn at some point, and we're going to discuss what I mean by rejoin turn later in the show, in the presentation. Remember, if you're the lead, you should have a plan in mind for how you're going to manage power reductions, because you want to give everybody in the flight a chance to rejoin on you. And if you stay at 30 inches and 2,000 RPM and you're going to climb up to 3,000 feet at that power setting, for anybody to rejoin on you, they would have to be at 30 plus inches and 2,000 RPM, and that's really hard on some of these old engines. So if you're the lead, what would you do if your wingman shoots out in front of you, crosses your 3-9 line? Well, you should check your gear, make sure that you don't have more drag, and that's why that happened. If the guy gets way out in front of you, and you, at that point, you probably should say, number 2, you have lead on the left or right, wherever the guy is. You can be directional to your wingman that you just gave the lead to. Fly straight ahead. I got to raise my gear. I'll be catching up to you, and I'll take the lead back in a second. What if your wingman falls way behind you? I'll look back and see if he left his gear down or it didn't come up all the way. Be sure not to throttle back too much, because at some point the gear is going to come up and the guy's going to accelerate. You don't want him to come screaming past you. If he's within eyesight of you and you guys haven't separated too much, what's the signal to let the wingman know that his gear is down? And it's a brisk upward jerking motion of your fist with your thumb up. And it's real obvious when you're giving this signal that you're not giving the guy an attaboy, you're telling him to raise his gear. Now now that we've taken off and we're joined up, we're going to talk about what we do when we're out there flying in the practice area. Now, there's a lot of formations that we transition from and to, but they all start with fingertip station keeping. So if you look at the T6 and draw an imaginary line from the outboard wingtip through the tail wheel, and another line from the front of the nose cowl through the inboard aileron gap, if you manage to fly your plane so that your eyeballs are at the intersection of those two lines, you're in fingertip, and there's about 10 feet spacing between your wingtip, your inboard wingtip, and the lead's outboard wingtip. There is another 35-degree intersection line, and that's not flown as a standard with NATA. The CAF will use that bearing line sometimes as a standard. So if you want your flight to fly that more acute bearing line, if you will, then it needs to be briefed during the brief. Otherwise, you can just say, we're going to take off, join up. And when you say join up, it means that everybody will join up in fingertip using these two bearing lines. You can be in front of the spot you need to be at. We always refer to being in front as acute. And if you're in front of your fingertip station, then you'll see air between the tail wheel and the wingtip, outboard wingtip. And you'll see the aileron gap behind the nose cowl. If you're behind the intersection of these two lines, you'll see the tail wheel in front of the outboard wingtip and the aileron gap in front of the nose cowl. And obviously, if you're on the line, then you'll see the aileron gap on the front of the nose cowl and the tail wheel over the wingtip. It's real common once you're in this position to oscillate, go forwards, backwards, up and down to some extent, and in and out a little bit. And during your training, what we want to do before we move you from a 2-ship to a 4-ship is minimize the frequency and amplitude of those oscillations. There's also a step-down sight picture when you're in fingertip station keeping. We're looking for the tail wheel and the wingtip, and only the inboard hubcap is visible. So if you're low, then there'll be air between the tail wheel and the wingtip, and you can see two hubcaps. If you're high, you can't see any hubcaps, and you can't see the tail wheel and the wingtip together. If you're in the right position, you'll see one hubcap and the tail wheel and the wingtip. So what kind of formations do we fly in using fingertip? Well, there's the 2-ship, which we refer to as a section or element. There's the Vic. There's the finger strong right. So if you look at your right hand fingernails and imagine a plane at each fingernail, that's finger strong right. There's a finger strong, and then there's a lead element and a trail element, and then there's the finger strong left, and then there's the diamond, and there's the echelon right and the echelon left. And these formations all fly around in fingertip station keeping. If we're in a Vic, a diamond, or a finger 4, 2 and 3 are across from each other in all of these formations. And number 3 is looking across the formation at number 2, so that as 2 oscillates forward and back, 3 is going to match him to keep the flight looking uniform. And the sight picture we're looking for is the canopy bow. And so if you're behind where you need to be, you'll get half a McDonald's arch, and as you move farther forward, it turns into a vertical line. And sometimes during training, to help you as a newbie in the number 2 slot learn the appropriate sight picture, if you're too far out, which is typically what everybody does, lead may tell 3 to move into position and park there. In other words, don't fly off number 2 anymore. Then it'll tell number 2, dress up, look where 3 is. That's how far forward you need to be. However, let's look at this guy whose cockpit we're sitting in here. If you look at the tail wheel and the wingtip, there's some air there, so he needs to move back some. However, the aileron gap is on the nose cowl, so where are we relative to the pictures we've been looking at? And so we talk about you can be acute and sucked and on the right spot, but you can be all over the place in reality. And in this case, the guy has fixated on just one of the lines and flown it in. It's much more common to fixate on a line but be too far out than it is to be too far in, because everybody gets pretty scared about getting close to the plane next to him. But it is real common to fixate on just one of the lines rather than looking at both of them. Now that we've learned how to fly in formation and fingertip, we're going to start moving ourselves around in the formation. And the first thing we're going to learn about is the single ship cross under. The signal to execute comes from lead, and it's a 90-degree elbow with a fist. And sometimes we practice these maneuvers on the hangar floor walking around before we get out in the air. Anyhow, this is what it looks like when we're airborne. Lead. We'll look at the guy he's giving a signal to. In this case, lead stares at 3. He'll give him a 90-degree elbow and a fist. 3 nods, which is an acknowledgement that I saw your signal and I understand what I'm supposed to do. 1 head nod. And then 3 will slide out the bearing line. 4, since 4 is flying fingertip off 3, just stay in position off 3 and you'll do fine. Once there's a gap opened up, lead will now stare at 2, indicating to 2, hey, I'm about to give you a signal. He gives him the 90-degree elbow and the fist. 2 nods, indicating I get it, I see it, I know what I'm supposed to do. And then you're supposed to slide back a little bit, slide over slowly, and slide into position so that we end up in echelon right. And what if lead then wanted to cross you back? He would stare at you again, give you the signal again, and you would slide back, slide over, and slide up again on the left side. Number 3 doesn't need a signal to know to come back to finger strong right. He knows that once you're moving out of the way, he needs to slide right back in there, and 4 is just flying off of 3, so 4 will follow 3 right back in. Since the cross under is the first maneuver you're learning to make inside the formation as a wingman, as number 2, we'll just review something, a real common error that happens all the time for everybody who's new to this. So lead stares at 3, gives him the signal, 3 nods, and slides out. Lead stares at 2, gives him the signal, 2 nods, and 2 is supposed to do this, but typically what 2 does is that. You slide out, you slide way far back, and you get moving pretty fast. And 3 and 4, or 3 and 4 is going to just follow, will start giving you more and more room as you start moving fast and as you start going too far back. It takes a lot longer for us to reconfigure the flight when you don't do it expeditiously. But however, it's very unnerving if you're moving too fast. Slow and controlled movements is what we're going to try to train to. And everybody gets it, but this is a common error that's initially made out of the gates. Next, we start moving 2 aircraft around. There's a 2-ship cross under. The signal is the double fist pump. So the way this works is lead looks at 3, indicating, hey, I'm about to give you a signal. He gives him the double fist pump. 3 nods, indicating, I understand, I saw the signal. Then lead starts sliding. 3 starts sliding back. If you're number 4, remember, you're just going to stay with lead. At this point, you might be thinking, man, I don't know what we're doing. Maybe we're going to close trail. I don't know. Maybe we're crossing under. When you see 3 start to cross under, you go with them, and at about this point, you realize, oh, we're going to echelon left, and so then number 4 knows to end up in echelon left. If lead wanted to now get you back into finger strong right, he could move 3 and 4 back by passing a double fist pump to 3 through 2. So lead will stare at 2, give him a double fist pump to 2. As you know from reading your manual, that's not a signal that you execute on. It's a signal that you must pass, however. So once you get the double fist pump from lead, you don't necessarily have to acknowledge this because you're not going to do anything, and lead can tell if you're passing the signal by looking at you. But you have to take your left hand, in this case, you have to take your left hand off the throttle and do a double fist pump to 3. You never take your eyes off lead. You never look at 3 to see if he got it. The only way you'll know if 3 got this signal is it'll either show up on your right side, or lead will pass the signal to you again, indicating that he didn't see what you just did or wasn't looking, so here's the signal again. All right, now we're going to talk about diamond. So here we are in finger strong right. And to move to diamond, it's 2 separate signals and a radio call. And the hand signals are the number 4 and then to the slot. So it's the leader will hold up the number 4 and then jerk his thumb over his shoulder indicating go to the slot. So this is a signal that's passed from lead to 3 to 4. So lead will look at 3, he'll signal the 4 to the slot. 3 knows that that's not a signal he should move on or execute on. He never goes to the slot, but it's a signal that he needs to pass. So in this case, he needs to take his left hand off the throttle, put it on the stick, move his right hand to the side window, and give the 4 to the slot signal to number 4. So this is a brisk signal. It's given quickly by number 3 so that he can quickly move his hands back to the throttle and stick, left hand on the throttle, right hand on the stick. Number 3 never looks at 4 to pass the signal. He always keeps his eyes on lead. And the only way he'll know if 4 got the signal is if he shows up on the left-hand side, or if the lead asks 3 to pass the signal again, he'll know he didn't move. So he passes the signal to 4, and then number 4 does the cross under into diamond. And at this point, number 4 completes the maneuver by saying red 4 is in. That lets the flight lead know that he can start maneuvering the flight. And at the end of the maneuvering, the flight lead will give a aileron waggle, which is a signal number 4 to return to his last position. You'll cross back and we'll end back up in finger strong right. This is what the diamond looks like from somebody flying behind it. So 2 and 3 are flying in fingertip off of lead. 3 is looking across the formation at 2 to be oscillating forward and backward with 2. And 4 is flying in fingertip off of 2 and 3, but is dead astern lead. So for number 4, your head's on quite a swivel. You know, for 3, you're looking at the 2 bearing lines and looking across the formation at number 2. And for number 2, you're looking at the 2 bearing lines and just trying to keep your eyeballs at the intersection. Close trail, what's that? What's the signal? What's the radio call? Well, the signal is an elevator waggle, and when you get that, then people start sliding down and back. And again, if you're number 4, you might not have even seen the elevator waggle because it could have been blocked by 3's aircraft. But as a good wingman, you just stay with number 3. Once you see that you're sliding down and back, it becomes pretty obvious that you must be going to close trail. When you see everybody tucking in, you complete the maneuver by saying red 4 is in. That lets lead know, once again, that 2, 3, and 4 are all lined up behind him. And he can start maneuvering. And once lead's done maneuvering, he'll give an aileron waggle, which again is the universal signal to return to your last position. And only 2 might have seen this. However, once 3 sees 2 moving, he knows, hey, we must be going back to our last position. And as number 4, once you see 3 moving, you know, hey, we must be going to our last position. And then everybody goes back to their last position, in this case, finger right. This is the number 2 sight picture in close trail. And what we're looking for is wing tips within the canopy bow and tips of the vertical stab within the canopy bow. That's one sight picture. Some guys fly wingtips and tail wheel within the canopy bow, and that steps down the flight a little bit more steeply. Some guys fly wingtips and tip of vertical stab within the canopy bow, and that slides the flight out more horizontally. Lead sometimes will brief which sight picture he wants you to use. But regardless of which sight picture you're using, it's important to make sure that at all times you have step down so that you're not flying directly behind anybody. And then there's nose-tail separation so that if you bounce up, you're not going to hit anybody with your prop. And this is the sight picture from number 4's vantage point. And in reality, 2 sets the step down and spacing, and 3 and 4 dress off of number 2. At all times, however, in this formation, we want to maintain step down so that we're not in anybody's kill zone. And we want to maintain nose-tail separation so that if you get bounced up by a gust of wind, you don't saw off anybody's tail. Route position now. So we're in fingertip here, and lead's going to move us out to route. And the signal is a rudder waggle, and the reason why we would do this is to increase our spacing so we have a little bit more reaction time so that you could go heads down for fractions of a second to switch radios, do ops checks, perhaps change tanks. So again, the signal is a rudder waggle. This is an aircraft signal again, so it's not something that needs to be acknowledged. You just execute. Some guys slide out, some guys slide out and back, but basically we're increasing spacing. And at this point, lead might go, okay guys, take a break, check your gauges, and everybody push 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'll check you out on the flip side. And then lead, after he checks everybody in, red flight check in, red 2, red 3, red 4, will then give a aileron waggle, which is the aircraft signal to return to your last position, and everybody will tighten it back up into fingertip. And so the question is, would you go to route at any time if you didn't get a signal to do so? What would you do if your lead gave you a frequency change and didn't waggle you out to route? And the answer is you go to route anytime you're going to go heads down for any reason, even if lead makes a radio change without sending you to route. So you're the lead, and what would you do if wing does not execute or respond to a signal? Well, you should send the signal again, and you should consider why maybe he didn't see it. Perhaps the sun is hitting your canopy just right, and he can't see your hand. So in that case, if you slide open the canopy and stare at the guy, it'll make it pretty obvious to him that you're trying to give him a signal. What would you do if wing executes on the signal but doesn't give a head nod? You should probably make a corrective action over the radio. Remember, we're trying to train ourselves to give a head nod. That's sort of our handshake. I stare at you. That means I'm going to do something. I give you a signal. You give me a nod. Wing executes the wrong maneuver, even though they nodded. Well, you can waggle them back with your ailerons, or you can say on the radio, nope, come back to where you just were. I didn't want you to do that. And is it your job as a flight lead, if you're in fingertip formation, to make sure that your flight performs fuel and ops checks? And the answer is yes. They're not looking at anything but outside the cockpit. They don't really have an opportunity to check their gas gauges or their engine gauges. And make sure you move your flight to route when you do that. So now we're going to talk about turns. In formations, we make turns in fingertip. That is, we're maintaining fingertip station keeping the whole time. And when we're in these types of turns, we refer to them as welded wing turns. In other words, we act like all our wings are welded together. And we also make turns in echelon. So these formations, the Vic, the diamond, and the finger four, left and right, always make turns using fingertip station keeping. We refer to them as welded wing, and it looks like our aircraft are welded together in space as we fly around. Here we are on the outside of a turn. It's number 2 or 3. Remember, now your turn radius, your circumference is greater than the guy in the window, than lead. So you need to be traveling faster to stay with him. Also, you've had to climb up in altitude, so you always need to throttle up on the outside of a turn, and you always need to ask yourself, am I staying in position? And so there's space between the tail wheel and the wingtip, so you need to move up a bit. There's space between the aileron gap in the front of the nose cowl and the tail wheel and the wingtip, so you need to move forward a bit. Here you go on the inside of a turn. It's the opposite. You need to throttle down. And from lead's perspective, you can always kind of tell if the guys are in position or not. Because remember, if everybody was in fingertip position, all the heads should be lined up. So anyhow, looks like the guy in the yellow aircraft needs to move down and back some. So again, on the inside of a turn, we throttle down. And we always ask ourselves, am I maintaining good station keeping? Here there's starting to develop some air between the tail wheel and the wingtips. You need to slide back. However, there's also some air between the front of the nose cowl and the aileron gap, and so we need to slide out some. Also, you can't see the tail wheel. You can't see the hubcap, so we probably need to move down a little bit. So where was that guy? Well, he had slid in between the lines, and it just goes to show that, we talked about being acute and sucked it on the lines, but in reality is you move all over the place, and you got to constantly maintain vigilance as to whether or not you're staying in the appropriate intersection of the two lines. The echelons, left and right, make echelon turns, and we always turn away from the echelon. So left echelon make right turns, right echelon makes left turns only. And common errors in echelon turns is number 2 steps up in the echelon turn, maintaining fingertip station keeping as opposed to flying an echelon turn. 2 or 3 or 4, where everybody gets sucked during the turn. If you roll into the turn too fast, it doesn't give anybody else in the flight time to catch up to you. If you roll out too fast, remember 2, 3, and 4 are traveling faster than you, so sometimes they'll shoot out a little bit in front. And it's potentially dangerous to roll out of a turn fast, so you don't want to do that. It's another common error if you're the lead and you're bringing your flight around to initial, which is lining up with a runway for landing. You didn't line up exactly right. Now you need to turn a little bit into the echelon to line it up just right, and you shouldn't do that. Never make turns, never bank into an echelon. So if you're in a left echelon, you never bank to the left. If you're in a right echelon, you never bank to the right. However, you can line up an echelon a little bit by using gentle redirection of your aircraft with your rudder. Just keep your wings level as you do it, and do it a little bit at a time. The 2 ship always makes fingertip or welded wing turns. However, if the lead wants you to practice an echelon turn, he'll tell you to do that with a radio call. This is the sight picture of number 4 in an echelon turn. What we're looking for is the tail wheel over the wingtip. We're looking for canopy rails on the horizon or the tops of all the canopies lined up. And we're looking for one pilot head. All the pilot heads lined up. So here's a picture. So it looks like the canopies are lined up. It does look like the canopy rails are on the horizon. The tail wheel's over the wingtip. Pilot heads aren't exactly lined up, so it's hard to say if number 2's a little bit too far forward or number 3's a little bit too far back in this case. But it does look like number 3, whose aircraft we're sitting in here, is a little bit too far wide. However, you don't want to be too close either. Remember, during these echelon turns, as we go into 30 to 45 degrees of bank, if we're maintaining 10-foot vertical spacing between wingtips, we've actually moved in closer to each other. But you always want to be in a position that if you roll out, you'll have to slide out a little bit so you maintain the 10-foot spacing between the wingtips. Here's an example of an echelon turn gone bad. This is the horizon line. You can see that number 2 is stepped up. Again, a common error for number 2, especially a new guy. Number 3 is sucked. Number 4 is even more sucked. These are common errors. As a lead, remember to roll into these turns slowly so that people can anticipate the turn and power up, and also have time to power down as you roll out. Don't increase your bank angle much beyond 15 degrees if you see this sight picture developing over your shoulder. If you're training mode, that is, you're not trying to line up with the runway, keep an echelon turn coming between 180 and 360 degrees to give the airmen in your flight a chance to stabilize and practice. If you notice by looking over your shoulder that they're hanging with you, you can increase your bank angle up to 45 degrees of bank. In this picture here, you might want to make a suggestion to number 2 to step down a little bit. Again, only do this if he does not have an instructor pilot in the back seat. Let's now talk about the pitch out. This maneuver is used to send the flight, which is in echelon, to extended trail. And there's a 3-part signal the lead gives to number 2. The first part is the circular motion of the index finger, and in this case it means we're going to do a pitch out, or we're going to do a break. The next signal is how many seconds the count is, and the third signal isn't necessarily given at the same time, so lead will give the pitch out signal and the count signal together, and as number 2 you nod, like, oh, I see that we're going to do a break on 4 seconds. And then the last signal is given right before the break, and it's the kiss off. So you basically kiss your hand goodbye to number 2, and that lets 2 know I'm about to break away from you. It's a fairly vigorous maneuver, and you don't want him to follow you until he does his count. So it's to sort of remind the guy, I'm leaving you now, see you in a little bit. And what angle of bank and how G's? The answer is it's a 60-degree bank turn, 2 G's level all the way around. And typically these turns are 180 degrees. So on high it looks like this. And remember, once lead breaks, you fly straight ahead and you start your count. Make sure your power is set to 25 inches and 2,000 RPMs. Again, you might have just throttled back just as lead broke, and you might be at 20 inches and 2,000, so you'll be decelerating. And you don't want to do that. We want to stay above 120 knots the entire time here, because during the brake turn, you're going to decelerate, and you don't want to decelerate below your stall speed. For a few seconds now, you are the flight lead, so you need to clear the airspace and then execute your turn on your count. How do 3 and 4 get the brake count? Well, they basically start counting potatoes when they see lead brake, and then when they see you brake, they stop counting and they go, oh, that must be a 4 potato brake. And remember, if you're number 4, when you see all the 3 aircraft in front of you lined up astern, you call red 4 is in. That lets lead know that you're all lined up and he can start maneuvering. Common errors: we climb or dive in the turn. We don't maintain 60 degrees of bank. We maintain something less than that, and typically that causes a wider turn. And so whoever's not maintaining 60 degrees of bank ends up with a lot of spacing between him and the guy in front of him. He's lateral to the guy, and he's much closer to the guy behind him if the guy behind him did a 60-degree bank turn. And it's real common once everybody's lined up for 4 to forget to call red 4 is in. So the 4 to 5 second break will give a 1,600 to 2,000 foot spacing. Once you're lined up in the extended trail, lead will either begin to maneuver, signal a rejoin, or he's broken you into extended trail in the downwind because you're about to land at an airport. If you're going to do maneuvering in extended trail, lead will go side to side and up and down. And as a general rule, you need to follow lead to whatever altitude he goes to. So if he goes up 500 feet, you go up 500 feet. You don't go up 200 feet. However, to maintain your spacing, you can lead or lag the flight path of the aircraft in front of you laterally to maintain your spacing. So if this is the flight path of the plane in front of you and you're getting too close, you can do a lag pursuit. And if you need to catch up, you can do a lead pursuit. You cut off the corners. We don't use power changes during extended trail maneuvering to maintain spacing. We use lead lag pursuit. You have to keep all aircraft in sight all the time. So if you're number 4, it's relatively easy. If you're lead 2 or 3, you're looking ahead and you're looking over your shoulder, and lead is looking over his shoulder the entire time to make sure he hasn't lost anybody. Never fly in anybody's directly behind anybody for an extended period of time in their blind code, because then they won't be able to see you over their shoulder. And rejoin from extended trail is used to collect the flight after we're done maneuvering. So now we're finally going to talk about what the rejoin is. So just a few fundamentals. Remember, in extended trail, we're setting 25 inches, 2,000 RPM. For the sight picture, we're looking to keep all the aircraft on the horizon, and we're trying to find the bearing line of the lead aircraft. So keep the lead on the horizon. That's the guy to keep on the horizon. Even if the other guys are low or high, try to keep lead on the horizon. And you want to find the bearing line, which is an imaginary line or plane, if you will, from defined by the outboard wingtip and intersection of the vertical tail. And so you want to fly your plane so that your eyeballs end up on this line. And if you're ahead of the line, if you're forward of the line, or if you're too far inside the circle, and we'll go over this more, we refer to that as being acute. If you're behind the line, you're too far outside the circle, or outside the turning circle, and you're referred to as sucked. And if you're on the line, then it looks like the outboard wingtip and the vertical tail have touched each other. So what the heck was I just talking about? Okay, so here we are in extended trail. Everybody has set their power at 25 inches, 2,000 RPM, except for lead, who's probably at 23 inches and 1850. You want to stay on altitude, which does not mean look at your altimeter. It means keep lead on the horizon. You want to stay dead astern, all the aircraft in front of you, wings level. And at some point, the lead will start a constant rate turn between 15 and 30 degrees of bank. And there is a signal to start the rejoin. Remember, first, lead is waiting to hear that red 4 is in, which means to lead all the 3 aircraft in front of me are lined up and we're all lined up behind you, lead. At that point, or anytime after that point, lead will give 3 to 4 wing rocks, which are 30 or 40 degrees of bank, left, right, left. And after he does that, he'll start a fixed constant bank turn to either the left or right. The rest of the flight keeps flying straight ahead. And as number 2, once you see lead start to show up in your left-hand or right-hand triangle window, then you start a turn. You roll into a 30 or 40 degrees of bank, and you don't roll into such a bank that you lose lead below the canopy rail. That would be a pretty steep angle bank. And you basically start defining a tighter turning circle. And you stay on that circle until your eyeballs fly into the bearing line. So remember, the whole time, keep lead on the horizon, fly around your circle till you hit the bearing line. And once your eyes are on the bearing line, you adjust bank to stay on the line, and no power changes until you close to about within 50 yards. Number 3 will fly straight ahead until number 2 is in his triangle window about 30 degrees off his nose. And then he'll enter a turn to move inside number 2. Now remember, 2 gets inside 3's triangle window faster than 1 got inside 2's, because 2 started on a tighter turning circle. And the same thing happens for 4. He'll wait until he sees 3 in his triangle window and then start a turn inside of 3. And every one of these aircraft keeps going around until they hit the bearing line off of lead. So once we start flying around the circle and guys are finding the line, 2 always joins on the inside of lead in fingertip. 3 continues up the bearing line until almost in position on 2, and then begins a cross under to lead's right wing in this case. And 4 does the same and joins up on 3's outboard wingtip in fingertip. So this is what it's supposed to look like when we've all joined up in fingertip flying around the circle after the rejoin is complete. 3 and 4 on the outside, 2 on the inside. Let's just review some common errors that happen during the rejoin. Most commonly 2 or 3 or 4 or some combination thereof tend to get low. Remember, if you're number 2 and you start going low, you're going to sort of force the guys behind you to go down, to step down as well. Also, it's real common for number 2, particularly if he's a new guy, to get within about 50 feet of lead and just sort of park there and stagnate, not continue to drive up into fingertip. So if you look at this picture here, here's 2, 3, and 4. Here's the horizon, and you can see that 3 and 4 are actually low, and actually probably 3 and 4 are also acute. They're forward of the bearing line. Sometimes someone will stay or move to a sucked position or move to an acute position, which is potentially dangerous. So this is sucked, and this is what acute looks like. Remember, if you're acute, your closing rate is faster than guys that are on the bearing line and a lot faster than guys that are behind the bearing line. Sometimes 3 or 4 cross under too early, end up way sucked, as an example of that. So now you have to use a lot of power as number 3 to drive up into position. So here's what it looks like from 2's vantage point, looking at leads, doing a good job of keeping lead on the horizon. However, he's just a little bit sucked, and at long distance that's perhaps a little bit hard to pick up until you start getting in closer. Here's a 4's sight picture looking at the rest of the flight, and you can tell that 4 is low, so you need to climb up. Now we've gotten, as number 2, we've gotten closer to lead, and now it's becoming pretty obvious that we're in a sucked position. And so what do we need to do? We need to turn inside. We need to move towards the bearing line. Here's the opposite. We've gotten to acute. We see air between the outboard wingtip and the tip of the vertical stab. And we need to decrease spank and turn to the outside to find the bearing line. So what the heck was I just talking about? So here we are flying around the circle. Here's number 2. He's inside the bearing line. His sight picture is this acute sight picture on the left where there's air between the outboard wingtip and the vertical stab. And to fix this, you need to turn outside, and you need to turn towards the bearing line. On the right-hand side, you see that we're in a sucked position. The vertical tip is inside the outboard wingtip, and we need to turn inside towards the bearing line. Okay, here's number 4, and it looks like everybody's doing a good job of staying on the horizon. However, everybody is a little bit sucked. So 4 is sucked on number 3, and 4 is also not on lead's bearing line. He's a little bit sucked on lead as well. And so if everybody was on the bearing line, what number 4 would see is just all the airplanes lined up on the horizon. And 3 and 4 and 2 are all supposed to fly off the bearing line of lead, except for 3 and 4, you can't always count on, for 3 and 4, you can't always count on the aircraft in front of you, in this case 2, or 2 and 3 for 4, to find the bearing line and stay on the bearing line. And so even though you're flying off the bearing line of lead, you never want to get in a position, if somebody's far behind the bearing line, of crossing their 3-9 line, which again is the imaginary line between the 2 wingtips. So this is what I'm talking about, looking at it from on top. Here we are, 2 and 4 have found the bearing line and they're flying up it to get into their position. 3, for whatever reason, isn't there yet. And this is a common development, and you can't get upset if you see this developing. You need to learn how to manage it. So 2 and 4 found the bearing line, 3 is sucked, and 3, says, oh, I remember watching the slideshow, and I'm supposed to, when I'm sucked, I'm supposed to turn inside the circle. And when he does that, he's going to sweep his 3-9 line back across 4. And so as number 4, you have to anticipate that this is going to happen, or likely to happen, and you should be prepared to turn outside, throttle back, and if necessary, undershoot. We're going to go over undershoot in just a little bit here. Never cross anybody's 3-9 line, regardless of how it developed. So the undershoot is a maneuver used to deconflict crossing or getting close to crossing a 3-9 line, or an unsafe closure rate on the rejoin. The way you execute is you go wings level, you throttle back, and you pass behind and below the aircraft that you're deconflicting with. Once you start doing this undershoot maneuver, you call it out. Red 2, red 3, red 4 is undershooting. Once you get on the outside of the turns, you stabilize on the horizon, you don't climb up, and you stop maneuvering. That doesn't mean you just fly straight. You can keep flying, keeping everybody in sight in a general turn, but you're not allowed to try to get back onto the bearing line until you get instructions from lead. So let's see what that looks like. So again, 2 and 4 are on the bearing line. 3 isn't there yet. 3 is going to make a turn. As number 4, you're anticipating this. However, you have already gotten too close to number 3. His 3-9 line sweeps right in front of you, and you need to deconflict because you're getting too close to number 3. So at this point, you do an undershoot maneuver. You slide down, you go wings level, you go to the outside, and you throttle back a little bit, and at this point you say number 4, undershoot. And lead might go, okay, I see 2 and 3. 4, do you have eyes on 3? And if you say, yeah, I do, I see where he is, I know what I should have done. Then, okay, 4, you're cleared back inside behind number 3 to recommence the rejoin. Remember, after you undershoot, you must await further direction from the lead, who becomes ATC in this case, before you do any other maneuvering. So we've talked about the rejoin and a technique that we like to use in training, using the tighter turning circle and flying that circle until you hit the bearing line of the guy of lead. However, there are other techniques, but we probably don't want to use them, particularly during training. Remember, the rejoin is not a race to see who can get on lead's wing the fastest. Rather, you're demonstrating your skills at managing closure rate and decreasing your heading crossing angle as your 2 aircraft get close to each other. Some of the guys use a more aggressive technique. They use excessive bank, and they gain lead pursuit, and then they use aggressive bank to then realign their aircraft with lead. So it looks like this. They make a real steep bank, and they just go shooting right across the circle. They fly a straight line rather than a curvy line to where lead's going to end up being. And this will definitely get you on lead a lot faster, except it creates some problems. So the problem that this aggressive technique creates is a increasing heading crossing angle as number 2 proceeds across the circle, rather than the decreasing heading crossing angle you get with the little circle inside the big circle technique. The heading crossing angle is the angle between the two flight vectors of the two aircraft. You can imagine that if 2 is going straight and lead keeps coming around the circle, this angle is going to increase. Remember, 30 degrees heading crossing angle, if you're going at 120 knots, which pretty much we are at 2,000 RPM and 25 inches, you're moving sideways at 60 knots. So anyhow, 2 and 1 are on a collision course here, and as I mentioned, the crossing angle is going to increase, not decrease, as lead comes around the turn. On top of that, the aggressive turn and run across the circle puts number 2 and 3 triangle window early, and it makes it hard for 3 and 4 to judge when they should start their little turn. So it sort of goofs it up for everybody behind them in terms of sight picture. On top of that, from 3 and then 4's perspective, it looks like 2 actually shot out in front of number 1. Obviously, it doesn't look like that so much in this picture, but at long distances, it really does look like 2 somehow got out in front of number 1. So here we are. It's, now this increasing heading crossing angle is really starting to develop as lead continues to come around, and 2 is just pointing at where he knows lead's going to end up being where they need to rejoin. And now you're really coming at the guy. And you're going to have, number 2 is going to have to bank very steeply to stop the sideways movement and match headings with lead. And so if 2 goes wing up, that is eyes below the canopy rail, eyes behind the wing, or if he peers out of control, like, you're just moving too damn fast, that's pretty much going to end the sortie for number 2. And you just don't want to be that guy. You don't want to be coming at anybody real fast at all during any of this maneuvering. So we've finished discussing the rejoin technique, and we need to finish up with the rejoins after takeoff. Remember, the rejoin is used to collect the flight either after extended trail exercise or after a takeoff. Rejoins after takeoff at a climb vector. In the single ship takeoffs, we use much the same technique and sight pictures as we do in the level rejoin. However, to accommodate the climb vector, lead will typically be at 25 inches and 2,000 RPM, and so all the other aircraft will be at about 30 inches and 2,000 RPM to make the rejoin more expeditious. The section takeoff employs what most guys feel is the most cool maneuver we get to do in formation flying, which is the 2-ship rejoin. And in this case, remember, lead and 2 are already flying around the big circle in fingertip, and 3 and 4 are coming at them in the rejoin technique in fingertip. And all we would caution you is that 3 and 4 close to the cross under, it might be wise for number 4 to increase the spacing a little bit between himself and 3 to give number 3 a little wiggle room for bank angle changes and throttle changes that might be a little bit more aggressive than you want to do in fingertip formation. Not to say that you must widen it up, but it's probably wise to widen it up as 3 and 4 close to the cross under in a 2-ship rejoin. And definitely if it's your first time doing this, you should widen it up a little bit. So during rejoins, if you're the lead, remember, maintain altitude, maintain a constant bank. Power setting should be 23 to 25 inches in 1850. Be a stable target. And again, only offer guidance if there's not an instructor in somebody's back seat. Common errors during this maneuver for lead are you change your angle of bank or you change your altitude as you look over your shoulder. Remember, for everybody, number 4 is going to have eyes on everybody during the start of this maneuver, and by the time we're into 60 or 70 degrees of turn around the circle, lead, by looking over his shoulder, should have eyes on all 4 aircraft as well. But if you're 3, then you need to keep 2 and lead in sight at all time. And obviously, if you're 2, you should never lose sight of lead. But however, if anybody does lose sight of the guy in front of them, for whatever reason, call it out. Say, I'm blind. 2's blind. Never lose sight of anybody below a canopy rail or behind a wing in a turn or a bank. If somebody does call blind, or if anybody does an undershoot, remember, lead manages aircraft separation. So lead might command the whole flight to terminate, go wings level, and then he'll say who has eyes on who, and try to figure out where everybody is in the airspace before we start maneuvering again. Now let's talk about lead change. There's 2 options mentioned in the manual. NATA has adopted to use option A. And to do the lead change, so what happens is if you're the lead and you want to give the lead to number 3, you point at 3 and then you point forward. If you're number 3, that is, you're taking the lead, you give a nod, acknowledging, oh, I get it, you're going to give me the lead. Then as number 3, after the nod, you move lateral, you power up, and you move in front of the old lead. And as you pass the old lead, you tap your forehead or your front of your helmet and you point forward. And that's when the lead change occurs. When you start, just as you're passing the old lead, as the new lead, you tap your forehead, you point forward. That is the indication I'm taking the lead. The old lead, who is now the new wing, will give you a nod and move into fingertip position. So this is what it looks like from a 4-ship perspective. Again, here's our numbering. And now you're given the lead to number 3, moves up, powers up, stabilizes, the new lead tucks in, and the flight is automatically renumbered. From a VIC, you give the signals, you move out, you power up, you stabilize, the new wing tucks in, the flight is automatically renumbered. However, most new leads will check in the flight just to jog everybody's memory as to what their number should be now. Remember, if you were 4, you're now 2. If you were lead, you're now 3. And if you were 2, you're now 4 in a 4-ship. For the recovery now, we're going to talk about getting back to the airfield and getting everybody on the ground. So during the recovery, lead is going to bring the flight down to initial in echelon to prepare for the break. We want, again, the speed of the brake to be greater than 120 knots so we don't stall out in our turns. And so some of the good leads will actually take you down initial in a little bit of a power glide to get you up around well above 120 knots because we're most concerned about stalling out close to the ground. Number 4 is usually placed over the runway center line at 1,000 feet AGL as we head over the numbers. And the reason for that is that we might be at an air show, and so we don't want to be maneuvering over the crowd. And also, if it's a multi-flight recovery, everybody's looking for the same target as number 4 over the center line. Brake is usually 4 seconds. On downwind, we want to get at least below 110 knots for gear and flap speed. State your brake altitude until you're ready to do your turn. And stay out above the altitude of the aircraft in front of you. Lower your gear where the guy in front of you or lead lowered their gear. However, you can take advantage of the increased drag of the guy in front of you if you want to decrease your spacing a little bit before you put your gear down. On the perch base to final turn, we want to descend. It's a continuous turn, and by the time we're lined up with the runway, we want to be less than or equal to 700 feet AGL. And the reason for that is there might be another 4-ship heading over the top of you with number 4 right over the runway center line. And so we always practice that because someday you'll be in a multi-flight formation. We want to start our final descent where lead does. So if this is a really long runway, 7,000 foot runway, lead might drag it down the runway at 700 feet before he starts his final descent. The final descent, we want to be power off, full flaps, and pitch for 80 to 90 knots down to the runway. We want to touch down at greater than or equal to midfield for 5,000 plus foot runways. Obviously, never lose sight of the aircraft in front of you. And for multi-ship recoveries, if you're on the second 4-ship or whatever, as lead, you brake when you're abeam the number 4 guy in the flight right in front of you. So this is the profile view. Remember, stay at traffic pattern altitude or 1,000 feet AGL on downwind. After your perch base to final continuous turn, we want to be wings level at or below 700 but above 500 feet. In other words, don't be maneuvering in a bank down to 200 feet AGL. We make a wheel landing at or greater than midfield on an appropriate length runway. Sometimes lead will drag us down the runway a little bit. If it's a 7,000 foot runway, there's no point in taxiing for 3,500 feet, so we might take you down a little bit past midfield before he descends. Sometimes the final got extended, lead might drag the flight back at 700 feet before he starts the final descent. Remember, during the landing, we touch down at midfield. We use alternating sides of the runway always. We make wheel landings only. Never let your inboard wing tip across the center line during the landing or the high-speed taxi. Keep on two wheels to about 1,000 feet, but at that point you should be slow enough to be able to three-point it and get it under control. If you're on the exit side of the runway, you need to clear the guy in front of you to cross. When you have your tail down, you have your aircraft under control. And by the same token, if you're not on the exit side of the runway, as in this picture here, you don't exit until the guy behind you has given you permission to exit. And the reason why we do this is, remember, the guy behind you might not have it under control, might be going too fast. And if you turn in front of him, he might come slamming into you. Lead is always going to land on the downwind side. However, if there's no wind or the wind's right down the runway, lead's going to land on the exit side. That way he doesn't need permission to exit. He can just exit, so he can be the first one off without any clearances. And how do you clear somebody to exit? Well, we want to use something like red 2, red 3, red lead. You're okay to exit. We've been marked at in the past by Tower for saying you're cleared to do something because it sounds like you're giving a clearance to somebody. So we want to use the words, you're okay to exit. Okay, so now we're going to discuss some of the common errors made in the recovery and landing. The first of these is the final tends to get extended, with each guy extending it a little bit more than the other guy. This happens for two reasons. First of all, on the brake turn, we're about 2,000 feet behind the guy in front of us, and that seems way too close to be landing behind that guy, even though you're really landing behind the guy who's 2 planes in front of you. Also, even if lead was making his turn inside the numbers, from the parallax view we have from behind, it looks like he's making his turn somewhere over the grass. And so the parallax view tends to make us want to go a little bit further on the downwind move before we start our perch base to final turn, thus increasing the spacing. And like I said, each guy adds a little bit to this, and we end up way out there with a really extended final. By the same token, we tend not to maintain our angle of bank in the brake turn, and we widen the downwind, and each guy adding a little bit onto that, and that also increases the spacing. Some of the guys will just start their descent early. They won't stay at TPA or 1,000 feet until the perch base to final turn. They'll tend to get low and perhaps looking for the same sight picture as a normal landing, perhaps that they're used to in their Bonanza or Baron. However, keep in mind we're trying to make a steep power off approach to the runway, and if you make this sort of low approach, high angle of attack, high power setting, drag it in approach, it creates quite an extensive wake, which is very difficult to fly through for the aircraft behind you, and it might very well force a go around. Sometimes we land short, we forget that we're supposed to be landing midfield, and that is likely to force a go around. And sometimes we three-point too early, we don't wait to the 1,000-foot marker, and that may very well force a go around as well. Remember, we're trying to keep the pattern close to the field. We're trying to get all 4 aircraft on the ground expeditiously. We should be practicing that every time. If you're number 4, you shouldn't be in the mindset, well, I get the whole runway to myself. You should be trying to, do the standard approach to landing, keeping in mind that someday we'll be landing 12 more planes behind you. And also try to maintain your 2,000-foot spacing, because even though it looks like you're too close to the guy in front of you, he's landing on a different side of the runway, and you're actually landing behind the guy that's 2 planes in front of you. Now let's discuss power settings. So remember, for a section takeoff, lead will, once we're rolling, lead will set 30 inches and probably get some RPM setting between 2,000 and 2,250. Wing, you'll have your prop full forward and take whatever manifold pressure is required, up to 36 inches to maintain relative spacing. On single ship takeoffs, it's max power 36 inches, 2,250. The first power reduction is usually to 30 inches and 2,000 RPM. Once we get through 100 knots, lead needs to be powering back so that he doesn't create incredible spacing between him and the subsequent elements or aircraft. In level flight, in the descent, flying down initial, lead will set 23 to 25 inches in 1850, and as a wingman it's 2,000 RPM and whatever manifold pressure is required to maintain station keeping. On the downwind, we want to start to decelerate 15 to 20 inches to obtain gear and then flap speeds. And on our final descent, we want to be power to idle and pitch for 80 to 90 knots down to the runway. And in the flare, add a couple hundred RPM to stay up on two wheels for the high-speed taxi to the end. Let's now discuss radio communications and aircraft and hand signals. Typical lead communications to the flight will be, red flight check-in, and perhaps some comment about any change in the runway or winds. And then a good lead, particularly for the first start of the day, will verify that everybody in the flight is ready to taxi, with some comment like red flight, anyone not ready to taxi. And then if he doesn't hear anything, the next thing he'll do is push over to ground or unicom. For frequency changes, we like to use the terminology go, which means acknowledge before you switch frequency. So an example would be red flight, go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then lead is expecting red 2, red 3, red 4 to acknowledge that you're going to go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or red lead can go, let's push 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which means don't say anything until I check you in on the other side. And then after a few potatoes, lead might go red flight check in, and you're looking for red 2, red 3, red 4. The go and push commands are used not as rigorously as we should, but the point of the go command is to get you over to a frequency, but then there's not an opportunity to check you in. For instance, you might be flying back to the airspace, and lead doesn't want anybody talking once you're back on tower frequency except himself. And the push might be as you're exiting the airspace to go to the practice area, lead will go push 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. For the same reason he doesn't want everybody acknowledging on the tower frequency or the airspace frequency. Then there's the urgency and emergency calls: boarding, terminate, knock it off, breaking out, and any other call you want to make if it's a safety of flight issue. Remember, terminate is a call that everybody in the flight has to acknowledge, and it's not a safety of flight issue, but whoever's making this call wants the flight to stop maneuvering. And an example might be, you're number 2 in a 2 ship, and your instructor pilot has told you, your instructor pilot gets on the radio and goes, red lead, let's terminate because you're not getting the training maneuver and we need to reset. Or perhaps it might be a knock it off call, and this is a safety of flight issue. Perhaps you've busted an altitude. You're supposed to be in the 3 to 5 block, and you went below 3,000 feet. Now we might be running into a flight in the 1 to 3 block. And so red 4 might have gone, red flight, knock it off. And then any of the knock it off or terminate calls need to be acknowledged by everybody in the flight. So if somebody goes red flight, knock it off, you're looking for a lead to go red lead, knock it off, red 2, knock it off, red 3, knock it off, red 4, knock it off. 2 and 3 typically don't say a whole lot. They just check in, red 2, red 3. Again, anybody in the flight, any member of the flight can make any of the urgency emergency calls. There's also fuel state calls for Joker and Bingo. You need to read the manual to bone up on what those mean. Red 4 talks a lot. Red 4 goes red 4, meaning I'm on frequency. Red 4 is on the runway. Red 4 is off the runway. Red 4 is in close trail, diamond, or extended trail. And a well-managed flight will have very few radio transmissions. It's helpful at times when there perhaps is 3 flights out in the training area. We're all at different block altitudes, but we all might be on the same frequency. So if one of those flights is using their radio a lot to manage the flight, it tends to get annoying for the other flights in the area, and it can even become confusing. You might get a radio call that you thought was for you, but it's actually for an entirely different flight. Okay, what does this signal mean? lead is looking at everybody and making a finger wave or a circular motion with his finger. And it could mean crank engines if you're parked on the ramp. It could mean run up for takeoff if you're lined up on the runway. And it could mean prepare to brake on, and the next signal is going to be how many seconds he wants you to brake on. What do you do when you see a signal? Well, you have to give a nod. What do you do if you're not sure what the signal was? You just keep staring and you're going to get it again. And what do you do if lead makes an incorrect signal? Suppose you're number 3 and lead gives you a signal to make spacing for number 2 to cross under, but number 4 is still in the diamond. Well, what you do if you see an incorrect signal is you stare at the lead and you shake your head no. You could go over the radio and tell them, hey, you forgot that 4 is in the slot. But you shake your head no, because we don't want to use the radio, and then lead will figure it out. The 90-degree fist elbow means different things for different people. So for number 2, the 90-degree elbow and fist means cross under. For number 3, 90-degree elbow and fist means make spacing for number 2. Vice versa, the double pump to number 2 means, hey, pass this to 3. And the double pump for 3 means do a 2-ship cross under to the other side of 2. This is the 4 to the slot signal. It's a signal that always gets passed from lead to 3 to 4. If lead gives you this signal as number 2, the guy's just confused, and you just stare or you shake your head no. But if you're number 2, 4 to the slot means nothing to you. It's not a signal you would move on. It's not a signal you would. So this signal is the hand signal to raise your flaps. The guy's opening and closing his thumb and fingers. It looks like a duck talking. If you see this when you're taxiing back, the guy in the aircraft in front of you might have his hand out making this signal. It's typically for the aircraft behind. Just make sure your flaps are up. If you see this signal in the run-up area, you might have left your flaps down during your hydraulic check and forgot to bring them up. But if you don't pick up the signal, somebody will give you a call on the radio, because we definitely don't want you taking off with your flaps down. These are hand signals to pass numbers. So fingers up is 1 through 5. Finger sideways is 6 through 9. So that's a 7, and that's a 0. And we use numbers to give counts. We use numbers to tell you what button or frequency to show up on. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 might be button 1, and 4, 5, 6, 7 might be on button 2. And sometimes we can pass a whole frequency, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You could pass those numbers to the guy next to you to say, hey, knucklehead, get on this frequency. This is a courtesy call the lead's given to his wingman saying, I'm about to start a climb. He might also give you a signal that he's going to start adding power. And these signals are described in the handbook. There's actually not a picture for everything. That's why we don't have it here. But you do need to read them, be familiar with them. If you can't imagine what they're talking about, when you get to the clinic, we can show you what they all are. You are definitely going to have to know what the HEFO or HEFOM signals are. You'll get asked this question during your oral. So it's this is an urgency signal. So why the heck would you want to give a hand signal when you're having a problem? And the reason might be that you don't have a radio and you need help from lead to get back to the airfield. So the way you give this signal is you get lead's attention, and the way you do that is you move up and out, and you rock your wings a little bit so lead will look at you. Then you put your forearm over your brow, you sweat some bullets, then you give lead a number. So in this case, you're telling lead, I'm having an electrical problem, which is probably why you can't use your radios, and that'll give him the heads up that he needs to get you back to the airfield. And if it's controlled airspace, it's good to have somebody flying you in there with radios. But otherwise, if you're having a problem, then say it over the radio. It's we're not supposed to be Nordo the whole time, just for the fun of it. And so if you're having a problem and you can use your radios to communicate it, do that. Thumbs up has a lot of different meanings. So if your thumb's up on top of the canopy bow, it means I'm ready and everybody down the line from me is ready to do whatever it is you want. If you're just staring at somebody and you give them a thumbs up, it means I'm ready. And if you give the guy next to you a jerking thumbs up motion, it doesn't mean you're doing a good job. It means raise your gear. If you see this signal, the pinky and index finger up, it means turn on your lights. If they were pointed down, it means turn off your lights. And I just include that here to indicate that there are a lot of different hand signals. They don't all have pictures. But you are expected to know them all, and you might get asked a bunch of them during your oral exam for your check ride. There are 4 standard aircraft signals, and remember, an aircraft signal doesn't need to be acknowledged with a nod. And so there's the aileron waggle, which means return to your last position. So if you were in a diamond, you go back to finger. If you were in trail, you go back to finger. If you were in route, you go back to fingertip formation. If you're a rudder waggle, means move out, take some spacing. Elevator waggle means go to close trail. And a wing rock is a long-range visual signal, and it means rejoin on me. And again, this is 30 to 40 degrees of bank, left, right, left. Rejoin on me, in fingertip, 2 on the inside, 3 and 4 on the outside. And if you're a wingman and you want to get lead's attention, it's you move up and out and do a gentle wing rock to get lead's attention. Then you can give them your HEFOM signals. We'll now finish up with a discussion of emergency procedures. And remember, as a PIC, you need to know everything there is to know about your aircraft, but there are some twists when you're flying in formation. So just to review, your best glide with gear and flaps up is 82 knots. At heavyweight, your stall speed in level flight is 62 knots. At 2G turn, it's 88 knots, which is why we don't want to do the brake turns much below 120, because you'll bleed off about 20 knots by the time you get around the turn. We never get close to VNE or our G limits. The gear speed is 130 knots, and if you go above that, you might rip off the gear door, and the flap speed is 110 knots. Above that, you might damage your flaps. Max power out of the engine is 36 inches and 2250. If you're getting more than that, something's wrong with your governor or your prop. And if you get in a dive at max power and you overspeed your prop at 2800 RPM, it requires an inspection. So even though you need to be familiar with all the EPs for your aircraft, the most common ones to show up at a formation training session are the engine runs rough and it quits. And that may be because you're flying formation and you're not managing your systems the way you normally do. You forgot to switch tanks. So if your engine runs rough, you switch tanks. You go mixture full rich. You check your fuel pressure. Hit your wobble pump if necessary. Go to prop full. Increase, that's low pitch, highest RPM to get as much torque as possible out of your prop. Check your carb temp. Maybe you need a carb heat, and check your mag switches. Make sure one didn't get shorted out. If you need to shut down your engine, it's make sure the idle cut off, throttle closed, mags off, fuel selector off so that you don't get a fire on landing. Prop full decrease now, high AOA to give you best glide, and battery off if there's a fire present. If you're going to make an off-field landing, obviously land into the wind. Complete your engine shutdown. Turn off the battery at the very bitter end, just after you say goodbye to everybody. Make sure your flaps are full. And all the veterans strongly recommend that you do not try to land on your landing gear, make a gear-up landing anywhere except perhaps the world's best-looking golf course or the world's widest, longest drag strip with nobody on it, no wires above it. If you lose oil pressure, what does your prop do? It goes to high AOA because the counterweights, if your prop is still spinning, is going to drive it to high AOA. If you're having an emergency while we're in formation, then here's the new twist. So if we're on a takeoff roll as a section, as a 2-ship takeoff, and you're having directional control problems, or you're having an engine problem, a power problem, or a vibration, or a noise you're not used to, you need to abort, and you need to call it out. You say 4, 3, 2, lead is aborting. It's imperative that you stay on your side of the runway. If you're the guy not aborting, it's imperative that you just keep going. And this is why we said earlier it's important to maintain your relative position during the takeoff roll. If for whatever reason the aircraft in front of you loses directional control and starts to cross the center line, by the time they do, you'll be out in front of them. And that's why we always want to practice, regardless of how wide the runway is, of flying the entire takeoff roll with our outboard wingtip over the grass. Once you get out in front of the guy, get airborne, and then sort it out once you're in the air. If you're in formation and you start to having a problem, a noise, a vibration, whatever, you pitch out and away from the formation, you announce your problem, and you work the problem. And if you have the presence of mind to tell people what you want, then you become directive. If you're confused, then you can ask for assistance. But in this case, you might go, I'm having an engine problem, point me at the nearest field, somebody get on the radio and tell them I'm coming in there and clear the airspace for me. If somebody breaks out of the flight, it's going to get noticed. And remember, we maintain element integrity. So lead goes with two, or two goes with lead. And the intact element that's not having a member have a problem, they deconflict, which means get on top and assist as you can, as indicated. We're now going to finish the presentation with a brief review of what to expect from your clinic experience. Remember, show up having read the manuals, have attended the ground school, watch the slideshow, try to learn the hand signals and some of the aircraft formations before coming, and set realistic goals for yourself. Our goal is to be safe and have fun. We're going to train you to be slow and predictable. And sometimes after a debrief, it might be confusing what the guy's trying to tell you because not everybody's good at explaining what they want you to do. And that's why it's important to just listen and then go find somebody who can do a better job of explaining it to you. While you're flying, if you think whoever's managing the flight is goofing up, save it for the debrief because during the flight there's only one flight lead. To maximize your experience, as soon as you get there, get scheduled for flights. Make sure you have training documents ready to go. If there's no training flights available, fly in somebody's back seat to get a different perspective. And also, if you're in a training flight, try to fly with multiple different guys in your back seat to get different perspectives. You should practice as much as you can, but don't get burned out while you're on any given day of flying. Make sure during the check-in that you get assigned a mentor if you haven't showed up with some buddies already. Make sure that you have a little magnetic aircraft to put on the training board. You will go on a solo ship evaluation hop with an instructor pilot. We'll go over that in a second. And initially, depending on how much progress you've made from a prior clinic or if this is your first clinic, you'll start with 2 ship training flights. And again, we're looking for stability and knowledge of the fundamentals, and then you're going to get assigned to 4 ships to polish you off and get you ready for your rec ride and check ride. This is what the training paperwork looks like. You can get it from the FlyFast website. The left-hand one is your training record. The right-hand one is the sign-off form that you'll get from your pilot examiner. During the solo eval hop, it's a short flight, single ship. We want you to take off and get up on 2 wheels and rotate at 80 knots, maintaining directional control and keeping your wingtip over the grass. As you climb out, we want you to get the gear and set your RPM at 2,000 without looking down. Once we get to altitude, you're going to do a couple brake turns, 60 degrees bank, maintain altitude, 2 Gs, and 180 degrees of turn. Some of the guys will have you do accelerated stalls to convince you never want to start one of those turns slow. We're going to fly a formation pattern, which is tighter and closer to the airfield than you're used to with your Baron. Remember, the perch base to final turn is a continuous descending turn. We don't really do a base and then a final turn. You want to be at 700 feet AGL lined up with final, and then your approach to the flare should be power off, flaps, and gear down. We need you to demonstrate a wheel landing and then staying up on the high-speed taxi to the 1,000-foot marker before you exit. Remember, when you arrive at these formation clinics, there's lots of qualified guys there who want to help you get your card. We love doing this, and we want to get more guys doing it. We've tried to present tonight the published standards for formation flying and specifically review techniques and procedures that we use within NATA. Keep in mind that there are many different techniques that can be employed to adhere to the published standards. Try not to be overwhelmed by lots of different opinions. Get with your mentor and try to sort out things that work well for you. So that ends the slideshow. Hope you found it helpful. So if you have any questions or comments, corrections, or additions you'd like to see added to the slideshow, please contact me, Jim Cook, or Greg Dexter. If you have noticed any spelling errors or issues with font management, just address those to Greg. He'll be happy to handle that. We look forward to meeting you at the next clinic to knock off some aluminum oxide. In the meantime, fly safe and take care.